The Sierra Nevada mountains lay buried beneath suffocating waves of snow. The winter of 1846 had not relented. For months, the emigrants of the Donner Party had been prisoners in a frozen tomb, surrounded by walls of ice, starving, weak, and half mad with despair. This was no longer a wagon train bound for California. This was a graveyard in the making, and what would unfold here would etch itself into the darkest annals of American history. This is the final act of the Donner Party's tragedy, the moment when the thin line separating civilization from savagery was obliterated, when desperate pioneers broken by hunger and madness turned to the one act most feared, most forbidden, the consumption of human flesh. The collapse of order by February 1847, weeks had bled into months of torment. The survivors inside the makeshift cabins at Donner Lake and Alder Creek could no longer pretend that hope lay just beyond the mountains. Food had long since vanished. Leather straps, oxhide, and tree bark had been boiled into bitter soups. Bones had been cracked open and sucked dry of marrow. Rats and stray dogs, when caught, had been devoured whole. Yet even these scraps had been exhausted. Children wailed until their voices gave out, falling into silence not from comfort but from weakness. Mothers rocked lifeless infants in their arms. Fathers sat with hollow eyes, too weak to bury the dead. It was then that the unspoken thought, lingering in every mind, began to claw its way into the open. The dead could feed the living. The first cuts, the first known act of cannibalism, came not with ceremony, but in silence. Bodies had been preserved by the cold, frozen stiff, staring at the ceiling of the cabins like grotesque statues. When the starvation became unbearable, survivors began to cut small strips of flesh from the already deceased. But survival demanded more. Soon, corpses were dragged outside, stripped, dismembered. Human ribs were roasted over weak fires. Thighs were carved into chunks and boiled in filthy pots. Fingers were gnawed like chicken bones. And then came the whispers. If the dead could sustain them, could not the living? The murder for meat hunger changed the very nature of morality. Where once these pioneers had been neighbors, friends, can they now regard one another with suspicion? Stronger men and women looked at the frail as potential meat. At Alder Creek, where the Donner family remained trapped, it was said that Keseberg, a man already distrusted and feared, grew darker, hungrier. He reportedly muttered of killing the weak, of seizing flesh while it was still warm. Some resisted, others quietly agreed. The difference between natural death and murder blurred in the howling snow. Did some of the Donner Party kill not for defense, not for anger, but for food? The testimonies that would later emerge were contradictory, but one truth remained. In the Sierra Nevada, death had become a currency and flesh the last commodity. The forlorn hope returns. While horror reigned at the camps, those few who had escaped earlier the forlorn hope, a desperate band of emigrants who had attempted to cross the mountains, had endured their own nightmare. Half had died along the trail. The survivors staggered into settlements, skeletal and frostbitten, some of them confessing that they too had eaten human flesh. Their arrival in California sparked horror, yet it also spurred action. Relief parties were quickly organized to march into the mountains and save whoever could still be found alive. But time was not a mercy the mountains would grant. The relief parties, when rescuers finally carved their way through the frozen passes in February 1847, they did not find a camp of pioneers. They found a vision of hell. At Donner Lake, corpses lay scattered, half buried in snow, stripped of flesh. Human bones cracked open for marrow lay in piles beside gnawed leather. In one cabin, a human liver and lungs were discovered in a pot. The survivors themselves looked scarcely human, gaunt faces, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes that darted with animal fear. Many wept upon seeing help arrive. Others cowered, clutching bones as though the rescuers might steal their last meal. At Alder Creek, the rescuers were horrified by what they saw. Keseberg, surrounded by corpses, admitted freely that he had eaten the dead to live. Some accused him of worse, that he had hastened their deaths. Whether true or not, his name would forever be associated with the darkest rumors of the Donner Party. The agonizing evacuation, the relief effort came in waves, for no single party could carry all the survivors at once. Children were dragged through the snow, crying out for parents left behind. Some parents, too weak to walk, begged rescuers to save their children first, knowing they themselves would not live to see California. On the return journey, more died, more bodies fell into the snow, and more desperate decisions were made. There were whispers that even some of the relief parties, caught in blizzards with too many mouths to feed, may have turned to the flesh of those who died on the march. The Sierra Nevada devoured them slowly, cruelly, one by one. The final toll by the time the ordeal ended in April 1847. 87 emigrants had begun the journey westward with the Donner Party. Only 48 survived. Nearly half had perished in the snowbound mountains, frozen, starved, consumed. Of those who lived, almost all bore the scars of the horror. Some would never speak of what they had done. Others openly confessed, justifying the unthinkable. We did what we had to do. But the shadow never left them. Even in California, far from the Sierra Nevada, they remain haunted figures, shunned by whispers of cannibalism, their names synonymous with horror. The legacy of the Donner Party, the story of the Donner Party, became more than tragedy. It became a symbol of the peril of greed and haste, of the arrogance of ignoring warnings, of the terrible cost of human desperation. And above all, it became a reminder of the thin veneer of civilization. When starvation and despair closed in, men and women once bound by law, religion, and morality became predators, carving survival from the flesh of their own. The Sierra Nevada, forever silent and white with snow, still holds their graves. Beneath those pines, where the wind howls through the drifts, lies the memory of the cannibal caravan, ordinary people driven to extraordinary horror. Closing words, the Donner Party were not demons. They were not monsters. They were men, women, and children, families who had sought a better life, and who found only the abyss. But it is precisely this truth that chills us most, that in their place, any one of us might have done the same. Hunger is merciless, and in the grip of death's icy hand, morality can become a luxury too heavy to carry. This was not just a tragedy. It was a revelation of the darkness that lies within the human heart, waiting, patient, for the snow to fall. That concludes Episode 3, Cannibalism and the Final Agony of the Donner Party, the Cannibal Caravan.